With all due respect, Congresswoman, Alan Dershowitz sneered, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension only years of unchecked arrogance could perfect. Your law degree hardly qualifies you to lecture me on constitutional law. The words sliced through the studio like a blade. The anchors froze, caught between disbelief and discomfort. A sharp intake of breath rippled across the audience at home. Millions tuned in live, witnessing a scholar revered by elites take direct aim at a black woman who had carved her way into Congress through grit, sacrifice, and relentless determination. For a moment, silence pressed heavy over the set. The cameras lingered on Jasmine Crockett, expecting her to flinch, to fire back in anger, to stumble under the weight of the insult. Instead, she simply smiled, not the smile of defeat, nor of dismissal, but of someone who had heard this tone her entire life and refused to bend beneath it. Her eyes narrowed slightly, calm and deliberate, as though she was savoring the pause more than the words that would follow. It was the kind of silence that rattled louder than any protest. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. The anchors shifted uncomfortably, realizing they were sitting at the fault line of something explosive. Social media lit up instantly. Did he just say that? Is he serious? She's about to destroy him. Dershowitz smirked, mistaking her composure for weakness. He tapped his notes, adjusted his glasses, settling back as though he had secured his victory in a single insult. But that smirk, that arrogance, would soon become the very thing to undo him. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just holding silence, she was building a storm. And when she finally opened her mouth, no one expected what Crockett said next. This was never just another TV debate. On paper, it looked like sparring over constitutional interpretations, legal theories tossed back and forth for pundits to analyze later. But beneath the surface, everyone knew the stakes were far higher. This was about credibility, about whose voice counted and whose could be dismissed, about who gets to be called an authority in America and who gets told to sit down. Alan Dershowitz came armed with prestige, decades of teaching, shelves of books, an aura of untouchable expertise polished by television lights. To his followers, he was the final word on constitutional law, a man whose resume itself was a shield. He leaned on it with every syllable, his tone dripping with the certainty of someone who believed credentials outweighed reality. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, carried no ivory tower. What she carried was harder, heavier, the lived experience of communities fighting to be heard, the scars of late nights defending those without power, the burden of service not measured in titles but in survival. She wasn't just speaking from textbooks, she was speaking from the battlefield of real life, where the Constitution isn't abstract but immediate, sometimes the thin line between dignity and despair. And that contrast wasn't lost on the audience. Millions watching at home saw it in real time. The legendary scholar looking down his nose at the young Congresswoman, dismissing her as though her law degree was an accident, her victories a fluke. The subtext was unmistakable: gender, race, class. Everything Dershowitz thought he could dismiss with a smirk. The crowd felt rising as tension in their chests. The anchors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Was this really happening, live on air? A man lionized by institutions mocking a woman who had climbed every rung of the ladder without their help. It was more than arrogance. It was a test of who America believed deserved to have the last word. Social media caught fire instantly. Hashtags erupted. Screenshots of Dershowitz's smirk spread like wildfire, each caption more incredulous than the last. Commentators typed furiously, stunned that the arrogance was so blatant, so unguarded, so raw. And yet, alongside that outrage, a question echoed everywhere. How would Jasmine Crockett respond? Because what everyone sensed was that this moment was different. This wasn't just a debate. It was a line in the sand, a confrontation that would echo beyond one studio, beyond one news cycle. Millions tuned in, not knowing they were about to witness a career-defining moment. And as Crockett adjusted her microphone, her calm still unbroken, the stage was set for the kind of answer that could flip power itself on its head. Alan Dershowitz didn't stumble into power. He built it brick by brick over decades, carving a place for himself at the very top of America's intellectual hierarchy. From the lecture halls of Harvard to the bright lights of cable news, his voice became a fixture quoted, debated, revered. For years, the name alone carried weight. Say Dershowitz, and people thought brilliance, the law personified, a scholar who always seemed one step ahead. But brilliance, unchecked, often curdles into arrogance, and for Dershowitz, the line blurred long ago. He rose quickly through academia, the prodigy professor whose lectures drew in students like gospel. To some, he was magnetic, to others, insufferable. He mastered the art of legal theater, wielding precedent like a weapon, his sharp tongue honed to slice through challengers. Soon, his classroom dominance became a national spectacle. High-profile cases found him, or perhaps he found them, and each victory fed his legend. From defending the famous to advising the infamous, Dershowitz became less a professor and more a celebrity, a man as comfortable in green rooms as in courtrooms. Cameras loved him, networks loved him, and most of all, he loved himself in their spotlight. But the brilliance came packaged with a trademark style: dismissal. Rarely did Dershowitz debate without condescension. Rarely did he argue without reminding his opponent subtly or directly that they lacked his pedigree, his insight, his gravitas. He did not simply disagree, he diminished. And time and again, audiences saw it. Sometimes they applauded, other times they bristled, but the pattern was clear. When a student raised a question, Dershowitz smirked. When a colleague challenged him, he bulldozed. When a journalist pressed too hard, he laughed them off. His career was built not just on ideas, but on the unshakable belief that no one else's ideas quite measured up to his own. And the world let him get away with it, because that's what prestige buys you. Years of Harvard credentials, best-selling books, and primetime interviews don't just give you authority, they give you a shield. He wore it like armor, believing it would protect him forever. But times change. The very arrogance that once passed as confidence now revealed itself for what it was: elitism. And elitism does not sit well in a country where people have grown tired of being talked down to. That's why his sneer at Jasmine Crockett cut so deep. It wasn't just about her law degree. It was about every woman told she wasn't qualified, every black voice dismissed as less than, every young leader told to wait their turn. The insult landed with weight far heavier than Dershowitz likely intended, and the audience felt it. The longer he spoke, the clearer it became. His shield of prestige was cracking. Because while Dershowitz believed his resume was enough to secure victory, he forgot a truth older than Harvard itself. In the court of public opinion, arrogance can be fatal. And Dershowitz was about to discover that prestige doesn't always win the room. Jasmine Crockett's story doesn't begin in marble halls or ivy-covered towers. It begins in the hum of everyday American neighborhoods where opportunity wasn't handed out but fought for. She wasn't born into elite networks or groomed for prestige. What she carried instead was grit, a relentless work ethic, and the fire of someone who knew what it meant to be underestimated. Her path to law wasn't smooth. It was paved with late nights, mounting debt, and a chorus of voices asking why she was even bothering. In classrooms dominated by privilege, she often stood out not just because of her skin or her gender, but because she refused to be silent. She asked questions others avoided. She pressed professors who didn't expect to be challenged by someone like her. Each raised eyebrow, each dismissive smirk became fuel. Law school was survival. While others leaned on family connections, Crockett leaned on sheer willpower. She worked jobs to keep herself afloat, studied in the margins of exhaustion, and carved her way into a profession not built to welcome her. The lesson was clear. She would never be given credibility, she would have to seize it. And seize it she did. Crockett rose through the legal trenches not by chasing fame, but by serving people who rarely had defenders. She took on clients who couldn't afford the high-priced lawyers, stood with communities others ignored, and treated justice not as an abstract principle, but as a lived necessity. Every case she fought was personal, not because it was about her, but because she understood the stakes for those who couldn't speak as loudly. That service-driven mindset became her compass. When politics came calling, it wasn't ambition alone that pulled her toward Congress. It was the knowledge that law without advocacy leaves people powerless, and silence in the face of inequality only deepens the wound. Running for office meant stepping into the storm, knowing attacks would follow, knowing the same whispers of unqualified and inexperienced would resurface. But she ran anyway. And she won. Not because she had the most money, not because she had the most endorsements, but because people saw in her something they rarely saw in politics: authenticity. She wasn't polished for the cameras. She wasn't rehearsed for the donors. She was raw, real, and unopposed. Crockett leaned back in her chair, her smile soft but unyielding. She didn't gloat, didn't raise her arms in triumph. She didn't need to. Her composure was the victory. Her calm dismantling, piece by piece, had exposed the cracks in Dershowitz's armor, until nothing was left but the hollow sound of a reputation unraveling. In that moment, viewers across America felt it. The underdog had flipped the script. The woman who was told she wasn't qualified had just taught a masterclass in what true qualification looks like. And as the cameras rolled, the anchors struggling to find words, the final image seared itself into the nation's memory. Alan Dershowitz, fumbling to recover, his face pale, his eyes darting, while Jasmine Crockett sat serene, her presence unshaken, her words echoing louder than any lecture. The studio lights dimmed, the debate technically over, but in reality, it had just begun. Within seconds of Jasmine Crockett's takedown, the internet erupted. Clips of her calm but devastating counterattack spread across platforms faster than producers could cut them. By the time the network cut to commercial, hashtags were already trending. Crockett fours Dershowitz, justice over prestige, and the simpler but even more powerful, she owned him. On Twitter, the first wave came from ordinary viewers, people live tweeting the debate who couldn't contain themselves. "This is the moment," one wrote. Another, "She just did what no one else has ever done, shut Dershowitz up." Memes flooded timelines. Dershowitz frozen mid-stammer beside Crockett's calm, razor-sharp stare. GIFs looped endlessly of the second he fell silent. Then came the professionals. Legal commentators, analysts, and even rival scholars chimed in. Some conservative voices tried to downplay the moment as overhyped television drama. But even among Dershowitz's usual defenders, the praise for Crockett's composure was impossible to ignore. Professor Melissa Murray, a constitutional law expert, tweeted, "Precision, poise, precedent." Crockett didn't just hold her ground, she shifted it. Lawrence Tribe, Dershowitz's own Harvard contemporary, posted simply, "Respect." She won this exchange, no question. Cable news couldn't resist the firestorm. Liberal networks replayed the clip on loop, framing it as the underdog dismantling the old guard. Headlines read, "Crockett's Legal Clinic on live TV," and "When Composure Beats Credentials." Conservative outlets, on the other hand, framed the clash differently. Dershowitz ambushed on liberal talk show, or identity politics dressed as legal argument. The split only amplified the reach. Both sides covered it, both sides debated it, and Crockett's words kept echoing louder with every broadcast. By morning, YouTube was flooded with reaction videos. Influencers paused the clip frame by frame, analyzing her delivery, the steady tone, the surgical timing, the way she let silence work in her favor. "That," one viral creator said, "is how you debate." She didn't just win, she transcended the debate format. Celebrities joined in too. Viola Davis retweeted the clip with the caption, "Queen Energy. This is why representation matters." LeBron James posted 3 flame emojis and wrote, "She cooked." Even unlikely voices weighed in. Elon Musk, tweeting a cryptic, "Credentials don't equal credibility," fueling yet another round of discourse. But beyond the pundits and celebrities, the emotional payoff came from everyday people. Teachers, nurses, small business owners, students, they saw themselves in her. For many, Crockett's words gave voice to something they had long felt but never seen so clearly articulated: that dignity and lived experience can stand toe-to-toe with elitism, and sometimes win. One viral post read, "She didn't just argue law. She argued for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong in the room." Another, "This was more than a clapback. This was justice speaking out loud." The validation was everywhere. People weren't just celebrating Crockett, they were thanking her for showing composure under condescension, for refusing to be rattled, for proving that humility paired with resolve could outshine prestige wrapped in arrogance. The network's own post-debate panel, meant to be a balanced analysis, turned into an awkward acknowledgement of the obvious. One commentator admitted, I've covered Dershowitz for 20 years. I've never seen him stumble like that. Ever. Another added, this wasn't just a debate moment. This was a cultural shift. And then came the numbers. By the next day, Crockett's clip had surpassed 25 million views across platforms. On TikTok, edits of her line, "Law isn't about how close you sat to power. It's about who you stood up for," were set to dramatic music, spliced into motivational montages. The phrase itself became a rallying cry, printed on shirts, turned into profile bios, repeated across classrooms and office conversations. Even young law students began quoting it as if it were already part of a textbook. One student wrote in a thread, "We memorize precedent. We memorize doctrine. But last night, we memorized courage. That's why she matters." Dershowitz, for his part, tried to make the rounds, granting interviews where he insisted he had been misrepresented. But the harder he pushed, the weaker it sounded. Clips of his defensive rambling were stitched next to Crockett's composure, the contrast growing starker with every replay. The battle was over, and the court of public opinion had delivered its verdict. Crockett hadn't just survived the insult, she had transformed it into the defining moment of her career. But what no one expected was that she wasn't finished. Because when the cameras turned back to her in her final closing words, Crockett didn't just declare victory. She reframed the entire debate. Cliffhanger. But Crockett wasn't done. She used her closing words to reframe the entire debate. When the storm of the debate seemed to settle, and pundits were already declaring winners and losers, Jasmine Crockett leaned back into her microphone with a calm that cut through the noise. The anchors tried to pivot to commercial, but her voice carried over steady, deliberate, impossible to ignore. "This was never about me versus Professor Dershowitz," she began, her eyes locked not on him but on the camera, speaking directly to millions watching at home. "It's not about whose name is in more books or who stood closer to power. It's about principle. It's about truth. And it's about service." The words hung heavy. For an instant, even Dershowitz, usually quick to interrupt, stayed silent. Crockett wasn't arguing anymore. She was elevating the conversation. She leaned forward slightly. "I know what it feels like to work 2 jobs while going to school. I know what it feels like to represent people who couldn't afford the kind of lawyers who get called prestigious. And I know this. True credibility isn't about the ivory tower. It's about whether you've stood with the people who needed you most." There it was, the reframing that shifted everything. Suddenly, the debate wasn't about which resume sparkled brighter. It was about something deeper, more human. Service versus status. Principle versus prestige. Dershowitz had spent decades reminding the world of his credentials, his proximity to the famous and powerful. Crockett, with a single turn of phrase, reminded the world that proximity to power doesn't equal moral authority. Instead, she framed dignity lived, earned, and defended as the highest form of credibility. Her voice rose, not in volume but in conviction. Law isn't about elitism. It's about justice. Leadership isn't about how many cameras you've stood in front of. It's about how many voices you've lifted. And dignity isn't about demanding respect. It's about showing it, even when it's denied to you. The audience, both in the studio and online, felt the shift. No longer were they spectators of a sparring match. They were participants in a moment of truth. Crockett wasn't just defending herself against an insult. She was reclaiming what credibility means in a country where too many have been told they don't belong. Tweets echoed her words in real time. Not prestige, principle. Service, status. This is what leadership looks like. The phrases became instant shorthand for the moral weight she carried. Her closing crescendo built slowly, like a sermon designed to leave no one untouched. To every student told their school wasn't good enough. To every worker told their voice doesn't count. To every person dismissed because they didn't come from wealth or privilege, remember this moment. Remember that dignity outweighs arrogance, every single time. The camera cut briefly to Dershowitz. His face, usually a mask of confidence, looked unsettled. Not angry unsettled, because in that moment it was clear the debate had left him behind. Crockett was no longer talking to him. She was talking past him and directly to America. And that's where the power crystallized. Viewers weren't just inspired, they were empowered. Teachers replayed her words in classrooms. Parents shared the clip with their children. Law students quoted it in study groups. She had shifted the debate from a personal clash into a universal lesson. That credibility is not given by gatekeepers, it is earned by living through struggle, by standing for truth, by refusing to bow to arrogance. The crescendo ended not with anger, but with resolve. Crockett's final line struck like a gavel. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about proving that every voice has value. And if you've ever been silenced, disrespected, or dismissed, let this remind you, you are more powerful than they want you to believe. Silence followed. Not awkward silence, but reverent silence, the kind that